And it's origination, so you might like to use this to continue. Homage to the Buddha, the blessed, noble, and fully self-awakened one. So tonight I thought we would have a look at this dependent origination. And we can start with the Buddha's victory verse. So this attempts to describe his joy at liberation. So he says, not having found, you could read that in Italian.
More?
Oh, yes, having, have you got the English version? You haven't got the English, oh. I don't know whether I have an English version. Oh, it doesn't matter. Having, is that the English version?
This one is Italian,
yeah.
But I can give you English if somebody's got.
C'è uno, sì. Puja, no. Guida, colloquio. Puja, no. There should have been, no? Strange, eh?
Sì, infatti c'era
sì. No problem. It's not a problem. Have you got an English copy of it?
No, it's just a part of it, it's not the whole thing.
Oh, okay. Not to worry, I'll...
This is something else.
No. Have you got the middle? Huh? No, I can translate. No, that's something else. Dalmatina.
That's in Italian.
Ecco. Yep, okay. So it says that having searched for the builder of this house, I've travelled through cycles of innumerable births. How painful is rebirth, constant rebirth. Builder of the house, now I've seen you. You're not going to build another house for me. Your rafters are broken, and your house is demolished. The unconditioned consciousness has been realized, and all impurities have been destroyed. So what he's saying here is that he's discovered the core problem of our suffering. And when he discovered that, there was a liberation completely from suffering. Now, don't get confused here. He still has physical pain, but all the pain that comes from emotional life, all that's gone. There's no impurity in his heart. And I want to point to this this phrase which says, la coscienza incondizionata, the unconditioned consciousness. See, the unconditioned now there's only one thing in the Buddha's teaching that's unconditioned, and that's Nibbana. Now Nibbana sometimes is translated, it depends on what root you want to choose for that word. So some translate it as no desire, but it would seem that the commentaries actually much prefer the unshackled. Senza catene.
Senza catene.
Ecco. So this
Questo è difficile.
Unshackled. What is it that's unshackled, where the chains have dropped off?
Staccate.
It's this vijnana, it's consciousness.
Conoscenza.
Now here we also have to be careful because words are used differently by the Buddha in different situations. Now some of you will know the 5 khandhas, the 5 aggregates. So the consciousness there is obviously not the consciousness he's talking about here, because the consciousness of ordinary daily life is conditioned. And the better word for this consciousness that he's talking about here is awareness. For what? Oh, vijnana.
Vijnana.
Vijnana. Yeah? Oh, sorry. Yes, excuse me. Thank you for that. It's chitta.
Citta.
I'm getting confused. Yeah, sorry. The word he's using here is chitta, which means the heart mind. So it would be our old word for the soul. But here, that's not what it means. This again is used to refer to something which is completely transcendent of the psychophysical world. So now what you will find in Theravada Buddhism, that there are these two types of interpretations. And it can be very confusing. If on the one hand you have a very a way of describing Nibbana, which is done by later works of the Abhidhamma. And what you get there is a sense of not knowing what this Nibbana actually is,
Nibbana.
except that it is transcendent. And without going into great, too much detail, there is another collection of scriptures which come from the same age, and they are only in Chinese. And in their Abhidhamma, then the word sati now becomes something which is different from what it is with Theravada. So trying to describe or trying to say what sati is can be a little confusing, because you'll hear perhaps some teachers say that it's just part of the mind, and other teachers will say no, it's something different. Now I tend to follow the transcendent description of it, because there are many phrases in the scriptures where the Buddha is pointing to that level of awareness. So the reason I'm saying that is that I want you to understand that underneath this process there is this awareness. Yes, and when you're observing things, you've brought yourself back into that awareness, even though it's not entirely pure, because it still has a feeling of being a self-awareness.
Self-awareness.
Self-awareness, yes. It's the last delusion, really. But the awareness is there, you see. So when you're in that position of the observer, the feeler, and everything you see as an object, you are positioned in the transcendent moment. The perceiver cannot be the perceived. Now, don't worry if you don't believe that. We're only discussing this process. Okay, so I just wanted to make clear that it's the awareness that becomes aware of this dependent origination. So you see, it begins with avidya, which means ignoranza. This ignoranza is not something that is culpable. It's not as though we should have known. So the best translation really is not knowing. Now, not knowing becomes a condition for sankhara. So sankhara are all our unwholesome habits based on this misunderstanding. So what is the mistake we make? What's the mistake we make? Say it to yourself. See if it's the same as I say. What's the mistake we make? It's to believe we're human beings. It's a big mistake. Conventionally speaking, we are human beings. This is indisputable. But what happens is that we then seek happiness in this form. Now, there is always a sense of anxiety with the self, because deep down it knows it's not real. So this becomes obvious as you move away from childhood and you realize that you're heading for death. So now what happens is that because we identify with this form, we of course seek happiness there. And what we find is that the happiness we get from this form is never entirely satisfactory. But yet, what we do is we feel happier the more we have. More money is better than less money. More friends better than few friends. More power better than little power. So there is a process of acquisition. And if you want the moral word for it is greed. Greed, you see. So there's this process of acquisition. Now, when we have something, then of course we have to preserve it. We have to guard it.
Sorry, I miss.
When we have something, collected something, we have to preserve it.
Okay.
We have to guard it. We must keep all enemies away from what we have. And so there you get your aversion. Now, when the enemy's too big, you have to run. So there you have your next set of attitudes, aversion and fear. So these three are running round each other. The ignorance, the acquisitiveness, and the anger, fear. So these have created all the habits that we have now that we see are unwholesome. These have created all the habits that we have now.
Queste.
Where am I? Oh, yeah. Now, Sankara, these habits that we have, are dependent on consciousness. You have to think of consciousness like a screen, a television screen. Without the ability of something to arise on the screen of consciousness, you wouldn't know them, of course. So the Buddha talks about them as being like two sheaths of wheat leaning against each other. Two sheaths of wheat. Wheat.
Giunco.
Grano. So if the one falls off, the other one falls as well. And consciousness is something which is arising and passing away with every object that comes onto that screen. It's and that's really what we need to begin to see, that everything is actually radically arising and passing away. That's what we really have to see. When we begin to see that more clearly, then the idea of substance begins to disappear. So remember, part of our process is to deconstruct everything, to see what it's made of. So this also takes away the sense of solidity. It's also true of objects. I mean, when you see a car, there's a concept of an object, one object. But we know it's made up of all sorts of little bits and pieces. And when you lay all these out on the floor, would you call it a car? You say, no. These are parts for a car. So as you deconstruct this organism, you begin to see that the organism is a concept. It doesn't feel like that. It feels real. So this is the delusion. So then you see, where are we? Dependent on consciousness, body and mind arise. Now the body here is not just the physical body that we experience. Of course, when you ask yourself, what do you know of your body, then you begin to realize that actually you don't know very much. So for instance, do you know what your liver is doing now? Do you feel the blood corpuscles rising out of the marrow of your bone, through the bone and into the bloodstream? I have to believe the scientists. But what we can begin to perceive is that the body, that our contact with the body is of a different type than the contact with the mind. And that contact with the body is known as the four great elements. So most of you know it. It's the earth element. This means the hardness, the weight of something. And then there's the a fire element, which is the heat or cold.
Freddo.
And then there's the water element, which is the fluidity in the body, elasticity. And then finally, there's air, which refers to movement. So when you're walking, doing walking meditation, see if you can distinguish these different elements. So the pressure of the foot on the ground is the earth element. and then you might feel that weightiness as you lift the foot, and then there's the movement. You see, so these and for liquid things you can feel it when you're eating the liquidity of the food. So what this means is that the mind is contacting the body, and it at the very base of it, this is what is actually feeling. This is what is actually. These are the basic sensations. There are these elements.
Ci sono questi elementi.
There are these elements. It gets a bit more difficult to see that with the eating, but the element of warmth, hardness, etc., will be there.
Sono.
Yeah, which are underneath the taste. With the eye, it would be seen as a fire element.
Fuoco.
And with the ear, it's the earth element, pressure. So this is the separation of the body from the mind. Now, the mind the Buddha says that the mind is foremost. It's the mind that's creating the world.
Foremost.
The most important. Now, you have to be careful here, because some schools in Buddhism are very idealistic, which means that the world does not exist outside your seeing of it. But the Buddha doesn't say that in the original scriptures. We definitely live in a world that we are creating. The mind is creating for us. The body-mind is creating for us. But the world out there exists independent of us. So it's interesting to contemplate that there's actually no light in the universe. The universe is completely dark. It's only because we have eyes that can discern photons that we have light. And there's no sounds in the universe. You have to have ears to hear to distinguish certain types of pressure, which we call hearing. So this takes us into the next one, that dependent on this combination of the our physical nature, which is part of the natural world. That's right. Dependent on this the physical world. Dependent on the physical.
Indipendenza del mondo fisico.
And the mind, which is interpreting. It can only do so through the 6 senses, or the ordinary 5 physical ones.
Oui.
The ordinary 5 physical senses. But the other sense in Buddhism is the mind. Where the mind touches the brain, that would be in Buddhism a sense base. So it wouldn't. So the Buddha's teaching wouldn't agree with a materialist view of life. That consciousness arises out of matter, an emergent property, as it's known.
Dalla materia.
In the Buddha's understanding, these are 2 quite separate forms of energy. And at death, of course, this mental body separates from the physical. We can talk about that later when we come to karma. See, now, once we have a sense base, and we have an object, and there is consciousness, then we have what's called contact. If there's an object and my sense base, my eye, sees it, and there's a consciousness of it, then we call that contact. If any of those are missing, then of course you don't see anything. So if there's no light, you don't see anything. If there's no eyes, you don't see anything. And if you're asleep, you don't see anything. So in the Buddhist psychology, those 3 things have to be there for us to experience something.
Of course.
And inwardly, of course, it's the sense base of our emotions and thoughts and images. Imagination, yes. Now, the next bit is where we determine that what we're experiencing is either pleasant or unpleasant.
Piacevole.
There are things that you can call neutral, but if you look very closely, you'll see that they shade into unpleasant or pleasant. So this is the dual world that we live in. Every moment of our lives is either pleasant or unpleasant, unless we're asleep. And that's why we like to sleep. We don't want to get involved with pleasant, unpleasant. It's the next link which is really important. And this word tanha is our reaction. So obviously we've been talking about this all week. How we are grasping onto something trying to maintain and develop what is pleasant, and how we're pushing away or turning away from what is unpleasant. This is the second noble truth. So he framed his teachings into these four truths, these four facts. So the first one is obvious. There is unsatisfactoriness. There is suffering. And the second one is that the cause of this is this type of desire. So remember that there are desires which are good, which we should actually activate,
Seguire.
such as the desire to meditate. But these desires that are based on the those three poisons, as they're known, those three roots.
Eh,
But the desire based on those three roots,
the
unwholesome roots, the ignorance, the desire, the greed, ignorance, acquisitiveness, and aversion, fear. Seeing that combination there, that's the escape. So remember, when you're sitting here, for instance, and there's pain in the knee, so the first is the aversion, don't want it. But we if you're not quick enough, we see the second reaction to it, which is move your knee.
Okay.
So the desire to put an end to suffering is based on an aversion of the pain. So if we are very still and we see that process, we're not actually reinforcing it. And in so, the reaction begins to die away. And then we find ourselves equanimous, peaceful, at peace with the pain. At that point, when you get to that point, say to yourself, although there is pain, there is no suffering. So the Buddha points out that there is dukkha. There's the suffering of pain. That's the problem. So we begin to see that actually, if I make it an object of my awareness, the awareness itself is not suffering.
Allora, se io faccio...
If I make that an object, the pain and the aversion, you've got to see that. So the Buddha also talks about two darts, two arrows. So the first arrow is the pain in the knee. The second one is our aversion. So you have to separate those to be very clear as to where the problem lies. It lies in relationship. See? And you can see that this transfers into relationship. Nobody can make you angry. Nobody can hurt you. This is all internal reactions. Interiore. This is what we've taught ourselves to react to certain types of people, certain types of behavior. See? So you can no longer blame your spouse for your misery. No, sulla moglie anche. So you can stop blaming people for the mental. So remember, if my suffering was caused by other people, how could I bring an end to my suffering? I'd have to get rid of all the people who upset me. It's the fact that we cause our own suffering where the liberation becomes possible. Now the next step, you see, is so subtle that we don't actually see it. Actually, you can, but you've got to be really, really bright and aware. And that is the point of identity. You see, we've discovered that physical pain or emotional pain is not actually suffering. It's just unpleasant. Both mental and we've seen that when we can observe it, the reaction of aversion and fear doesn't actually make us suffer, even though it's unpleasant. The reaction of fear or aversion, although it's unpleasant, we're not suffering. But at the point of identity, upadana, you are the pain, you are the emotion. That's when you say, I am, I'm angry or I'm, etc. And you behave. It expresses itself in the way you speak and act. This this identity is the moment when we actually begin to suffer. If you're having a hard time and you're saying to yourself, why does this happen to me? Why not to everybody else? You see, then you might not be aware of it, but you are in a state of suffering. I once saw a cartoon, and there's a woman in bed, obviously dying, and many friends were around the bed. Said, "Why me? Why not one of you?" So she's suffering, huh? So now the next link is the point of action, bhava. As soon as the identity is there, then there is a commitment, and this commitment manifests as an energy, and there's an action. Now, we've been, when we, I've been pointing out that when we eat, there's that moment of intending to eat. Now, you can stay in that intending to eat feeling for quite some time, and nothing ever happens. But at some point, you have to commit to that, and the energy goes in, and suddenly you're picking up the fork. So that moment is an action. It's the empowerment of the will, and because of the identity, a self is created. So this sense of self is always being recreated. So there's nothing stable about the sense of self. It arises with every action, or prior to every action, whether the action is one of thinking or speaking or doing. And then once you've done that, of course, there's the beginning of an action, the process, and the end. So sometimes this is taught, remember, as 3 lives. So that when we are born with the ignorance and the habits of our past lives. And then when we die, we go through another cycle carrying the new habits with us. But if you look, but of course we're doing it every day. Yeah? So there are these 2 teachings. One is more immediate and one is to do with rebirth. And it's because the self is constantly being recreated that we don't call it reincarnation. Because nothing is actually the self. It's not the same self. So that's the process. Now, the reverse process. Really, there are 2 points where this whole, what the Buddha calls a kasa, this whole edifice completely collapses. The one we've discussed, this where the desire arises, the wrong desire arises. So we can say that one moment of wrong desire has arisen, but because we've not empowered it, it's died away. One moment when a desire arises. So even in that moment, you see, we've broken down some of the rafters in the roof. So that's where we're looking at the characteristic of suffering, desire. But at base, we attack the problem of ignorance. And that's every time that we see that things are truly impermanent, that they're truly not substantial, and that our control over our lives is superficial, then we're actually beginning to destroy the foundations of this edifice. So that's why it begins with, when ignorance comes to an end, unwholesome habits come to an end. See, it starts from the bottom up, you see, slowly undoing all the bad habits that we have. And that's this is encapsulated in the verses of Vipassana. That's why we chant them, yeah. So that, in a very short way, is understanding this dependent origination. And it's the Buddha's just trying to make clear for us how we can undermine, how we can completely eradicate all our suffering. Once you begin to see how it works, then you do begin to see the possibility that there really is an end to suffering. The Buddha was much more interested in process, how we become a human being, not the question what is a human being, not what or why. Oh, I can only hope my words have been of some assistance, that I have not created even more confusion. But by your insight into dependent origination, you will be liberated from all suffering, sooner rather than later.
Sadhu.